Hi everyone and welcome back. Welcome to my another brand new video, and this video is part of the same full stack clone application development which we are doing. And here I'm going to talk about Next.js with the GraphQL. So we have already covered lots of stuff on the Next.js. Next.js I'm talking about Next.js 13. We have built so many applications. Now I wanted to cover another just one independent video which talks about Next.js with the GraphQL. So we are already aware that how we do the integration of Next.js with the REST APIs. Either those REST APIs are built externally, or you are creating Next.js API routes and then client components are accessing those API routes. So we have already talked about and discussed all different integrations. You can just use a Prisma ORM at the Next.js API layer, and then Next.js APIs can consume a Prisma client and can access the database. Similarly, we also discussed about TRPC server. Let's say you already have an independent TRPC implementation. So Next.js APIs can use those TRPC server and can redirect or can handle all the requests through the TRPC server. Similarly, what we are going to do in this, what is the simple architecture? We will have a client component, server side components. Client components which we are going to write, those will use Apollo client, because when it talks about GraphQL, then we mostly use Apollo GraphQL, Apollo client, Apollo server, or a Yoga GraphQL server, or there is a Yoga GraphQL client. We are sticking to the Apollo GraphQL client. So client components will use Apollo client, and then they are going to access these GraphQL API server, and these GraphQL API server are exposed through the Next.js API routes. So this is the Next.js. From the Next.js, we are going to do the query to the Apollo server, and those query mutation subscription we are actually doing to the Next.js API routes, because Next.js exposes these APIs for us. We can just write a Next.js API route, and those API routes can be a, you can say can be a gatekeeper for your TRPC server, can be a gatekeeper for your GraphQL Apollo server. So all those things can be managed by the Next.js API routes. So let's say we are writing Next.js 13.x application, and here we are building one API implementation. So in the Next.js we can create API routes, same as pages. With the app directory we can also create a routes, API routes, though those can actually render or handle the requests coming from the client. They can respond in the JSON format. So we all have already seen how we were handling these API routes through the TRPC server. Now the same thing is, we wanted to handle it through the GraphQL Apollo server. So whatever the APIs you are sending from the GraphQL, those API routes will be handled or will be used by this Apollo GraphQL server. So what you need is, you need Apollo GraphQL client configured with the Next.js that will trigger a request to the Next.js API routes, and Next.js API routes will be handled through this Next.js, through this Apollo server, GraphQL Apollo server. So we need to somehow put the GraphQL Apollo server and GraphQL Apollo client. Apollo client will be in the Next.js a client component. Apollo GraphQL server can exist with the Next.js API route. So you will send a request to the Next.js API routes like API GraphQL. That will be handled by the Apollo GraphQL server. And in Apollo GraphQL server, we have a query, mutation, subscription. So important part, before you do the end-to-end implementation, you should already be familiar with the GraphQL implementation, like how GraphQL works, what is a GraphQL query, mutation, subscription, how to write a plain and simple GraphQL server using simple Node.js Express, maybe using a Yoga GraphQL, or maybe using a Apollo GraphQL. Because if you want to build an independent GraphQL server, there are many ways of doing it. You can do it with the Express with the Apollo GraphQL server, or you can just use this Apollo GraphQL server independent. That will also use this Express app instance. Then there is a Yoga GraphQL, and there are many other libraries are available which will help you to just build the GraphQL server. So there are other implementation. Yoga GraphQL also uses Express. So Express is just an HTTP server, and the GraphQL query mutation subscriptions are based on the library you are using, like Yoga GraphQL or Apollo GraphQL server. So all those things we are doing, we will be writing query, mutations and subscription, and all those things will be packaged with a schema, because GraphQL server exposes a schema which contains all the types, all the queries and all the mutation subscriptions which you can trigger to the GraphQL server, right? So either you can use a type GraphQL or just a simple express type script can also do the job. And we need to use this Apollo client at Next.js client components. So we need to use HTTP client library, like Apollo GraphQL client library, to trigger the GraphQL request. So we will be triggering the queries and the mutations. Queries to fetch the data, mutation to change the state of the data. So here I can just create a create next app latest application. I will just create a simple skeleton. So here we'll just creating a simple folder structure. Through this baseline, I will be using TypeScript, ESLint setup no, Tailwind CSS yes, source directory no. So there are many ways of creating a 13.x application. Either you can have a source directory, or by default you can just use app directory. If you enable source directory, then source directory will be the root, and inside that you will have app. I didn't choose a source directory, so it shows me the app directory in the root. And I can create all the other folders like components, lib, helpers, pages, all these folders you can create in a GraphQL, because we are going to do lots of things on the GraphQL side. So this is our basic setup, and we have everything here: Tailwind, post CSS, auto prefixer, and we have created this Prisma folder, and this is very basic setup with the layout and page.tsx. So what we are going to do first, we are going to focus more on the GraphQL side. We can just remove this content which is already there, and we just keep only barebone Tailwind CSS with the global CSS, page layout, and this is our app component. Now we have components, pages, Prisma. So we actually prepared the folder structure based on that only. Now what we will do is we will create an env folder and env file. Inside that we can just check, okay, what is our database URL, next public URL, database URL based on what we are going to have, because we are going to use Prisma here. So the GraphQL will trigger, will call the Prisma client to insert, update, delete, fetch, or whatever the database operations we are going to perform. So here we can create a Prisma client. First of all, schema.prisma, and then the Prisma client, which will give us the Prisma client instance. And inside this Prisma schema Prisma, we can define the Prisma models, like what all things we are going to use. The just a client provider is a PostgreSQL Postgres client, and here is a data source. Data source we need to specify, okay, what is your provider. Provider can be your Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, all these different providers. And inside a URL, you are getting the URL from .env. So it automatically looks for the .env file with the database URL. And then further you can define all the data models which you are going to have in the application. Inside db.ts, we will just define a way to access the Prisma client. So here we can just export the Prisma client, which is coming from Prisma client. Okay, so we will also add all the different library like Prisma client, Prisma, all the different libraries keeps adding. This is a main dependency which we are adding. So let's get that installed. And the Prisma client is also installed. And here we can just use Prisma client, and we can export the Prisma globally. Like here we can just do a small caching. If one Prisma client instance is available, just return that, otherwise create a new Prisma client instance. So that is coming from Prisma client. Okay, this Prisma client we can use on all these places. So this particular file db.ts we are going to use to access the Prisma instance before accessing any models and try to insert, update, delete data in the database. So here we are getting the new Prisma client, and we are assigning that to the global prisma.prisma. So if the environment is not production, we can just like cache this instance, otherwise just return this prisma client. Now we can define all the models. So when it comes to model, like what we are doing in this whole GraphQL application, so we are going to define the novel. So it's like kind of a book management. Here we are managing all the novels, and then all the other associated models we are going to define. So the default is UUID, ID, title, description, all these different properties we are going to add. Images of type string, IDs of type UUID, and default ID, that's a primary key, and default is UUID. And then author, like who's the author of this novel, right? So we have ID as a primary key, ID default UUID. So either you can have ID is auto incremented numeric key 1 2 3 4 5 6, or you can have a UUID or a CUID, and this novel has a relationship field as author novel ID. So first of all, novel ID is of type string, and this relationship with the novel ID reference with this ID from this table. So it's like a relationship, we are associating this author with the novel. So this author has a novel ID, right? And there is a relationship of author. Here we can define the author as an array. So this author can have multiple novels written and then created at, updated at, default is now. So if you're not passing created at, default will be added as a current timestamp. And so there is a novel and author. Now I don't want to create a big models, just wanted to play with these two models. That's enough to understand the GraphQL implementations, queries, mutations and all, and how the Next.js will be using Prisma client, Apollo GraphQL client to access the data through this Prisma Apollo GraphQL server, because we need a client, like we need a TRPC client to access the data through Next.js routes Prisma server. Similarly, we need Apollo GraphQL client to access the data through Next.js API routes GraphQL server. So we already know how to write a simple API routes. So this is a simple hello routes, and then this is the GraphQL implementation we will write in the APIs. So Next.js API route handler will use this GraphQL Apollo server to satisfy the request. I mean, in the APIs you can create a folders and you can create whatever you want to add in the handlers. So there is a special handler we are creating that will redirect the calls, the requests coming from the Next.js client to Apollo GraphQL server. So we are just checking the documentation, like this is how we are defining the query and mutations. And this is a simple implementation, like how to get started. Here we are defining the type definition, like the type books and then query and the mutations. So this is like type def, and this type def you can just pass into server. Apollo server is taking only type definition, which is just a schema like what all types, and the resolver is nothing but an implementation of your queries and mutations. Like when you are sending a query, what actually should happen at the GraphQL server, like how to fetch the data, how to read and write the data, that is inside a resolver. The query, the schema contains, okay, your query will look like this, you can just send these many parameters. Mutation, when you are creating or deleting, you will send those many parameters and it will create a record. Resolver contains the implementation. So we have a query, mutation, subscription are type of the schema. Resolvers are the implementation, and Apollo GraphQL server takes two arguments, schema and the resolver. So Apollo GraphQL server is actually a handler. So here we have created a hello.ts, and the next file we have created is a graphql.ts. So whenever the request coming from for API GraphQL, the graphql.ts will handle those requests. Okay, so let's create this graphql.ts, and we will install all the required libraries like Apollo server, Apollo client, and there are some libraries like Apollo client, Apollo server, and the GraphQL. We already have added the Prisma client, all the other libraries. Now the rest part is creating a GraphQL server, defining a schema, and inside a schema defining the types, queries and mutations, and then adding resolvers. So it's like same GraphQL server which we were doing earlier. This is Apollo GraphQL server. So here we are just creating Apollo server, and Apollo server can use this Express implementation to create. It's like a same as Express app, right? App dot you create app instance and then app dot listen, and it will start listening on particular port for the REST APIs. So it's somewhat similar. If you just look into the documentation also, like how we are doing it, and then we are using this spatial library. And what this library does, this library is providing a handler or a hook between Next.js and the Apollo GraphQL server, because Next.js is a handler. It's like API route. How API route sends all the requests to the GraphQL server, that is being done by this handler. So we have to install this package pnpm add AS Apollo GraphQL server integration with the Next.js, and then we will just provide this as a middleware to forward all the requests to the GraphQL server. And here we are just getting the Prisma instance and then starting our server. So we are just following the documentation provided by this AS integration package, and we will just create a simple server with the middleware. Okay, so here we are creating context. So this is the Apollo GraphQL context. If you have done some bit of GraphQL server, then the context, inside context we can pass the data source like Prisma or type ORM database connection, MySQL connections and all, so that in the resolver where we are writing actual implementation, we can access the same data source to do read, update, delete in the database. And Apollo server is simple like this. We have to specify type definitions and the resolver and export default simple Apollo server. And the remaining part is this handler. This is how you will bind the Next.js API handlers to the GraphQL handler. And here we can just specify the Prisma in the context. And this is Apollo server we are passing. Apollo server we have already created. We just need a type def and the resolver. So that is the major part of doing a GraphQL server, creating a type definitions and defining the resolvers for the query and the mutations we have in the system. Okay, so what we will do is we will just create a schema.ts in the GraphQL and start defining the schema definitions like the types, queries and the mutation. It has its own simple syntax. And here we are going to create a resolver.ts. So we have schema, queries, resolvers and mutations, all the things together. So here we will just create export const type defs. Okay, so we will define the queries. So this is how we can do the GraphQL. So here we will define all the types. I think there is a typo. So here type novel, right? And there is a type author. These are the same type which we have in the entities, which I have defined. In these types, we can just define what all the types, ID, name, descriptions and all the things. And the query means the functions like, okay, I need a novel, all the novels by author ID. Okay, it's all about getting the data. Query is all about reading the data, and mutation is all about, okay, creating the novel, assigning author to a novel, updating a novel, or removing an author from the novel, or a listing. I mean, all the CRUD operations where you are actually creating the resource, updating and deleting the resource, that will come inside mutation. And when you are just fetching it, reading it, so like novel by ID or give me all the novels, that is the read operations. Give me all the novels or give me a single novel, that is read operations. So those are inside a query. Other than that, we have like add novel, remove novel, update novel, delete novel. All those different operations which are actually changing the state can be a part of mutation. Mutation is all about changing the state. So here you can say update novel, and that will have an ID and the payload. ID will be of type ID, and that is required. And then you will have a payload, and this is update, you can say delete novel. And this is, I think, assign add author to the novel. That's correct. And then the delete author from a novel. So there is an ID. Okay, this is the ID, and then this is the author. It is going to return the author. Add author means we need a novel object like to a novel to which we are adding the author. So novel ID we will take, and the name, novel ID, and it should be author ID, right? I think the logged in user would try to assign himself to the novel. So we'll get the ID from there. Delete novel, just give me the ID. Update novel, give me the ID and title. We are just showcasing the simple examples. So we got all the types, like novel will have ID, title, image, created at, updated at, and novel will have the authors also, like what all authors this novel, what all authors has contributed to this novel. So now we have defined the schema. We can define the resolvers and the queries. So we can just define a separate sections for the queries, for the mutations, and for the resolvers. Okay, so here I will define all the queries which I'm going to use in this. So query is all about get novel. So these are the queries which will be used by the client, because these are the GraphQL queries which you can just directly pick. So inside this we will have a query, and what is the name is, query name is novels. Give me all the novels, and inside the novels, once you are returning the data, return me ID, image, created at, and updated at. All these attributes you should be giving me when the client is asking for returning all the novels with the author. So here I'm expecting that, okay, give me all the novels. So the line 4 is just a wrapper. Line 5 is the query definitions, where the query definition starts. So novels, I need ID, image, created at, and I also need authors for each and every novel. So similarly, we will have a get novels, get novel. Here I'm just looking for a single novel. So I will be passing a one parameter in this query ID, and the same ID I will be passing inside this, which is of type ID. And here we are doing aliasing, line 18 and 19. The $ID will be referenced, and then we have a query and mutation. So once we have created a query, now here we can just create a novel, update novel, delete novel, assign author, or remove author. These all will become the mutation, and inside a mutation we always will be passing some argument, because it's all create. So you need to pass the payload, you need to pass the ID which you want to update with the payload, all those things. So here the name should match with the schema. Add no, like these names, add novel, novels, novel, all these must match with whatever you have defined inside a schema. So add novel, we are asking for the image, title, and I think name. So these two arguments we are expecting, and then inside this we will call the same, just create these alias. Image is at the rate image, title is at the rate title, and then we can just so this is a mutation. Once this is all done, what all things it is going to return? It is going to return the created novel with the author assigned to it. So this is the add novel. We can just copy the same for update novel, delete novel, and all, and we can save over time. This is add novel, this is update novel or delete novel. Delete novel will take a ID as an argument which we wanted to delete. So this is an ID of type ID. We don't need second argument. Same argument we will pass to the delete novel. IDs of type string, IDs of type ID, and this is the delete novel. So this is delete novel, and this works. We are just returning the whole data. I mean, we can skip, we can just return the ID which has been deleted, or whatever the argument, whatever the list of data you wanted to return, ID, title, and image. That means this particular novel has been deleted. Okay, so similarly, add novel, update novel, and delete novel. These are all the mutations which we are creating for the novel. So here we have update novel. So that update will be based on the ID. So what we will do is the first argument is the ID, and the second argument is, okay, I wanted to update image, I wanted to update title of the novel. So that you can just pass, and once it is returning, it will be returning the updated novel with the author information. So that's correct. So these are all the different methods we have created: update novel, create, add novel, and these are in the mutations, right? Similarly, there is add author. So we are assigning author to the novel. So update novel, delete novel, create novel, and then there is a add author. So author is of type mutation, and here we are going to pass a novel ID, and then there is, I think, name we are passing. So here we are passing the name and the novel ID. So okay, there is a novel ID to which we are assigning this author. So there is add author is the method name. So similarly we can create the other one. And now it's time to create resolvers. So this is the actual implementation of whatever you have defined inside a query and the mutation. So the query, here we are defining, like inside a resolvers, we are actually writing the actual implementation of whatever we have defined in the schema, like query novels, give me all the novels, novel by ID, or add novel, update novel, delete novel, add author. All the implementations will be here, and here we are going to define the resolver. Let's say because we have a novel and we need to resolve the author with the novel, right? So we also have added a resolver for the novel. So here we are doing our first query. So that query is like give me all the novels. So resolver methods contains 3 argument: parent, argument, and the context. Context contains the data source and all the other attributes. So here you can see from the context we got the Prisma, and context.prisma dot the model name, which is novels dot find, right? So we can just install a Prisma generate. That will create a Prisma client. Otherwise I need to close the VS Code and open it again. Now I can just use context.prisma.novel, and then here I can see find unique. That is based on some ID, right? Because here we are passing where close, where ID equal to the ID which we are passing in the arguments.id. So that is specific novel if you wanted to return, and then another is novels. Give me all the novels. So here we are not passing ID, so it's a simple query. Find many and don't pass any argument, and it will return you all the novels from the system. Here you can add some limitations, like if you wanted to include author also, include author true, and you can also add some pagination if needed, but this is going to return the novels with the author. And how we are resolving the novel with the author is, this is the argument. So this is called a resolver. We are resolving the novels, how to fetch the novel data with the authors. So here it is doing prisma.author.find many, and here we can specify the relationship where the author ID, sorry, novel ID is the ID which is being passed parent.id, because this is really important to understand what we are doing, because we are getting the novel with the author and author with the novel. So we need to resolve the novel definition with the authors. So what we are doing is, if you look into simple example here is context.prisma.author.find many, and we are getting the ID. So let's say we wanted to get the author's information with the novel object. So inside novel we wanted to fetch the author. So novel will have the novel is the parent ID, right? Novel contains the ID, and here we are fetching the author based on the novel ID. So give me all the authors for this novel where the novel ID is this. So this is called the resolving the author's information, and we can use these data loaders to optimize this, because whenever you are fetching a particular novel, you need to trigger a query to the authors table to fetch all the authors. So it's like if you are fetching 10 different novels, you will be triggering 10 into number of authors which exist in the database, right? For each and every novel, you will be triggering a query to the authors table. This can be optimized using data loaders and caching in the GraphQL. So now inside a mutation it's all about add novel, delete novel, update novel, add author, remove author. So here we will be accessing the Prisma client, context.prisma.novel.create, and pass the data object. Inside data object you can just pass the image, title, and whatever we are passing in the argument. I think it's title and image. So that is your novel, add novel. And similarly we will have other ones also, add novel, and this is update novel, and then delete novel. So here we are doing update based on the ID. So what it contains 2 argument, where clause, where ID equal to this, and this is the data which is going to be updated. So args.id, and this is the data which you need to be update with. Update model, add novel, update model, update novel, and then delete novel. I think delete will just we have just an ID. So here we'll just do a delete based on the ID which we are getting from the arguments, where ID is arguments.id, a simple one. So here we have defined the query, mutations, and the resolvers. So like finally is the add author. So we are doing is inside update author, we are just creating the entry for this novel ID and this author. So here we are getting a novel ID, which is coming from the argument.novel ID, and then we already have the name of the author. That's it. So this is how we are adding, and the removing is all about just delete this, where novel ID is this and name is this. I think we are passing both the argument. Here we are just deleting the author based on just an ID. Okay, so we have defined the resolvers, the mutations. So inside the resolver you can see three things: all the custom types like novel, we need to resolve it, and then query and mutation. So now we have schema already available, we have the resolvers already available. What we need to do to just make our Apollo server up and running, we just need to import the schema, GraphQL schema, and the resolvers. So here we can just do a type def is available now, and then we also have a second argument is the resolver. So resolver is also available, and we'll just pass it. So this is our Apollo server is ready now. And this Apollo server we are passing to this middleware, this hook, which is allowing communication between the Next.js APIs with this Apollo GraphQL server. Now we will just start talking about the UI components. Like we just need to create a providers will be using this Prisma client and all those sort of things. So here we will create a Prisma client will use HTTP link library. We will see that. So here we are creating a provider, and that will be just using children's, and it will render that. So this is the provider wrapper we are creating. So inside this provider we will be allowing all the child components. Why we need to create a provider? Provider is like a root level element. Whatever you are putting inside this, like the GraphQL Apollo GraphQL client, so all the child components should be able to access this client. So that's why we put this provider on the top of the component hierarchy and render the children inside it. So we are passing the client, and we'll just render children. So same way we are creating this Redux provider or TRPC client provider and all. It's like common, we are using everywhere. Okay, so this is a provider. Now use this provider in your root level component. Render your root level component with the provider as a child component. Okay, so inside a provider you render all your children's, because this is like a root level component which is accepting a children, and it is rendering the children inside Apollo provider and passing the client. So this is my root level page. This will be available when you are hitting a novel /ID. That means you are trying to access the data of that particular novel based on the ID. So we can access the novel ID through the params. Right, for now we can just pass the create a props, and you can create a custom type props, and that props will have the params will have ID as a string, because we are writing TypeScript, so we need to take care of these things. Params will have ID of type string. That's it. So here this params is of type ID, and this is a props. So inside params we are accessing the ID, and this is whole is of type props. So this is resolved, and then this is an arrow functional component we are creating, and we are going to use these Apollo GraphQL queries like use query, use mutation. These are the hooks already provided by the GraphQL to access these GraphQL methods. Okay, so here we are just going to use, this is the novel, set title, and then there is another thing is const title and image is URL, set URL, and here we are using hooks because this is a use client only component. And then there is a name, set name if you wanted to use the name. So it's like a simple form we are creating, that to allow you to add a novel, update a novel, delete a novel, and all those things. So we are going to use a mutation. So use mutation is actually a hook that can be used to create a mutation, and use query to just fetch the list of data, like use query get novel, that's we already have, and you can just pass all the variables like get novel. And if you are trying to get only a novel based on id, then you will pass the variables. Otherwise, if you try to fetch all the novels, then there is no argument. Here you can pass the id. So this hook will give you everything. If you got the data, that means the GraphQL has returned you the data. Loading, that means it's in progress. Error means you got an error while getting the data. And we already registered a GraphQL provider, so we don't need to worry about what is the GraphQL endpoint, because we already have created a GraphQL client in the provider. So we just need to worry about using use query, use mutations, and trigger the update, fetch the data using use query. So here we are passing add author, novel ID, and the name, and refetch queries. That is really interesting. So once you update the state of the data, you want to re-trigger the get APIs. So in the GraphQL, you can just refetch the get novel and pass the variable ID. So it will fetch the data, fetch the novel based on the ID again whenever you are adding an author. So here in the refetch queries, you can pass the array of queries you wanted to fetch once you have updated, deleted, or created a record. So this is add author. Delete author is another thing. That delete author, you are passing just an ID, and here we are importing all these queries, because add author, delete author, all these queries we have already created in the Next.js. So here refetch queries, once delete author is done, we will just refetch and we will just fetch the same novel based on the ID. Update novel, trigger the update novel query, and here in the variables we will be passing some data. So its update novel is, we are passing ID and the title and the image. I think these are the three arguments we are passing. So same thing you will do is, these are the variables, and once it is done, you can just refetch the get novels. Get novel or get novels. So this is how you will configure the Prisma client, and then this is how you will use these hooks to fetch all the novels, update novel, delete novel, add author, remove author, all these different. Now you can use these loading attribute, because initially we wanted to show all the novels, right, or a novel by ID. So if it is loading, show the loading. If it is an error, oh, something wrong. Otherwise, you got the novel by ID, and show that novel with the image and title and some more attributes. So here we can also create some interface, because we are a little bit worried about the types, like authors is of type author, iNovel will contain it. So here, once you got the data, the novel data, which is of iNovel, novel dot. So here we will have all these attributes like ID, image. So because this is only about particular novel, so we have just the image. If it is image is there, then render the image source tag. And we can also use the Next.js image, novel.image. Specify the height and width. So this is how we can render the image. I think there is something wrong. Okay, the attributes are missing. Okay, so this is novel.image, and we have another attribute which is novel.name. So this is just another page, Next.js API route page, which is just rendering the novel name and the novel image. Now what we need to do, once both the data are available, novel.authors, if the authors are available which has returned this particular book, then we can also have a simple map operation, novel.authors.map, and render all the author information about that particular novel. So it's like the whole information about the novel image, novel title, and novel authors, because authors we are getting inside a novel object, novel.authors, and just a map. And here now interesting point is, I just added this, like you also wanted to remove author or add author, that we can do here is delete author, and we are passing the author ID. Okay, author.id. And when you wanted to add author, then there is another method which we can trigger is add author. pass the novel ID and the author name. So this delete author will be triggered, which is taking just an ID as an argument. Okay, similarly, like handle add author, because this is a DOM event. This DOM event will trigger this GraphQL Apollo GraphQL query. So react.form event and event dot, so the form event is of type HTML form element, and here e dot prevent default, and we can just do is if name is provided inside a form, because we are going to add some kind of a form, then return. Otherwise, if name is there, then we can do add author to this particular book, and we can just pass the variables. Variables is like, okay, novel ID, which is an ID, and the name is the name which you are passing. That's it. So this is like you are triggering the GraphQL mutation through the DOM event. Similarly, there is a handle update novel. Let's say you are passing the name or the image, title or the image of the novel. That's not empty. I mean, one of them is provided, then that means we can both are required. I think if one of them is empty, then we are returning. Otherwise, update novel, pass both of these attributes in the variables with ID. So this is the ID, and then two more argument is title and the image. Simple. This is how we are triggering the update novel. So the DOM events will trigger these mutations which we have created through the use query and the use mutation. Use query, you don't need handler, because on load we need to fetch the data, but we need to do add author or update novel based on the DOM events. So there are DOM event handler we have created that will trigger those actions. So this is the home class home page. There also we need to fetch all the novels. So we'll be using a use query and passing the query is fetch novels. Okay, so here we need to get all the list of novels, either in the root component we can do, or once you have the novels, we need some place to render the each and every novel card. So you just pass the novel object, and then novel card will display that individual novel information. So this novels is actually a list which we are going to fetch. So const novels will get the data as a props. So here we are doing use mutations like add novel. So we are passing image and title, and refetch queries. Once you are adding a novel, I wanted to refetch all the novels. So that is true, right? Because on the line 13 we have already using use query get novels, and when you are adding a new novel, we need to show that updated the list with the newly added novel. So we can refetch the query fetch novel, and here we are passing import the component, and we can just render that novels component. So while fetching the novels, the state can be the loading error, or if we got the data, then we will just pass all the novels to this novel component. So first of all, we just need to write a form component, because we also want to add a novel. So we need a title and image input field. So form handle submit flags vertical margin and space horizontal x3 and handle submit. This handle submit will take care of submitting the form and adding a novel. So this is event element. Event element is of type form event. So this is form.form event, and this is of type HTML form element. e.prevent default, and then we can just do add novel and pass the variables. Here inside an object you can pass the variables which contains the image and title. Image and title, we are already using this use state which is bind to this form. So whenever you are changing anything inside a title and image, we will capture both the attributes, and when you click on to the form submit, we will submit the form by calling this add novel. It's very pretty much simple, and I have these two input text fields, simple set title and set image, which I am calling as a hook. So it's like input text field, values title, values image, on change. Inside this arrow function, I am doing a set title, set image, very basic for the React developer. So we have two input text field, and input type is submit. So when you click on to this button, handle submit, on submit handler, handle submit will get called, and handle submit we are already doing add novel. And once the novel has been added, we have a responsibility to show the list of all the novels also. So we can show that through the grid gap is grid column 4, grid gap is 2. So it's a column 4 grid, we got all the novels. So novels you will get from the data. So data.novels, that will be novels, and inside novels, I think we are not exporting this interface, or just export it from here. Now we got the novels, we can just render that novels.map, and we can render the novel component inside a novels. So it's like a parent component has an array, and I will just run a map onto that, and inside each and every iteration I will render the child component novel inside it. I forgot to add a return statement. This is an array map and it should return something, and we'll just import the novel component. That will do the rest of the job, and here most of the things are ready. Now inside a novel component, it's a pretty much simple. We have just an image and title to show, so we can create a simple card component that will just have these both the information. Now let's play with this. We have a Docker Compose up. I will just check if I can start the Docker Compose. I will kill all the Docker containers because they might be accessing the same port. And I will do Docker Compose up. That will give me my containers. I need a Postgres container to have my database up. So I will do Docker Compose up. That will give me my container. So this is my Docker Compose file. It has two containers, Postgres and MongoDB. We are just worried mostly about Postgres. Docker Compose up, and I can see MongoDB and the Postgres is up and running. And Postgres is on same port, which is 5432, and username and password is there. So this is database will work, and we can just start the application. We can just do npm run build and test everything works, like there is no typing issues and all. We can just also do the Prisma migration because we have a schema models which we need to apply to the database. So we will have a tables created. These are the tables has been added, like the novel and the author table. Novel will have a author ID. So the author will have a novel ID. So this is the primary key foreign key relationship, and we will just start the application. Npm run dev, npm run build, and npm run dev. If everything is fine, we can start our application. So this application is a showcase of how we can use the Apollo GraphQL server with the Next.js API routes, and how we can configure the Apollo GraphQL client with the Next.js component, so that Next.js will have this React provider, and they can access the GraphQL queries and the mutations and fetch the data and show the data in the components. So we'll just check the build, and we will start the application. I think build we have already done. So npm run dev will start our application, and we will see that. So here is a simple example. Okay, so here this is the GraphQL endpoint. So when you try to go to this endpoint, we should see the GraphQL server, right? It has all the queries and the mutation. If you have any other GraphQL client, you can access it. We have the authors is actually a type, add novel, add author, and all. So I will just use my own client. This is my client which I like most. I will access the documents, send request, and here I will show you all the documents, novel and novels by ID and novels. And then I can add the query, and we can run the query. I can see the one novel, right? And I can get all the novel by ID also. Like I copy this particular ID, and then I will trigger novel by ID. Here from the one single click, you can actually add the query in the left panel. That's what I like about this plugin. Run query and you got the novel. So that means novel by ID works. Those are query. Mutation means we are adding a novel. So here just create an image. Image name should be a URL. So I think title should be hello, and that should be image, and that's fine. So here we are doing just give me all the novels. So you can see the new novel has been added without the author, and then we can assign the author also. So this is pretty much what we have in the Next.js, a simple landing page. And when you click onto this particular page, we can just use the novel ID. So here I'm just deleting this particular novel. That's done. And if I do the query again, so here all the novels, then we have only one novels. Okay, so what we can do is I will copy this ID and we can also assign the novel. So this is how a simple novel, and when you go to a particular novel, you will have an option to update or assign the author. Okay, this particular image URL, add novel. So here we can also inspect like what all different queries we are triggering from the front end. Here you can see the request payload, the URL in the add novel, and we are just hitting a single endpoint API GraphQL. And API GraphQL post request, inside post we are sending query mutation. So it's like this is the GraphQL, not REST APIs. So we are just accessing the same interface, just different queries and different GraphQL mutations we are triggering. So this is pretty much all about this particular demo end to end. Here we are using Prisma for the database operations and GraphQL queries and mutations to so this whole setup is all about Prisma as a ORM and Apollo GraphQL client, Apollo GraphQL server, end-to-end integrated. So this gives us lots of learning, like some of the projects are using the REST APIs, but if you already have Apollo independent server, then you can actually plug that with the GraphQL Next.js API routes and just write a Next.js client components to consume these queries and the mutation. So that's all about this whole demo. Thank you guys, thanks for watching.